On a cold March morning in 1945, a young woman in khaki overalls knelt beside a 3-ton lorry at Number 1 Mechanical Transport Training Centre in Camberley, Surrey. Her hands, stained black with engine oil, worked a spanner around a stubborn sump plug, whilst a sergeant instructor watched her technique. Grease had worked its way under her fingernails and smudged across her cheek. The workshop smelled of petrol, burning metal, and the peculiar sharpness of battery acid. Nothing about this scene suggested that the teenager wrestling with the lorry's reluctant drain bolt was His Majesty's daughter, the woman who would one day become the longest reigning monarch in British history. Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was 18 years old, and for the first time in her extraordinarily sheltered life, she was doing something genuinely useful. Not symbolic, not ceremonial, not standing on balconies waving at crowds or christening ships with champagne bottles. She was learning to strip down a Bedford OY engine, diagnose why a Mark II ambulance wouldn't start on a freezing morning, and understand the 17 separate things that could go wrong with a military vehicle's ignition system. Her fellow trainees, working-class girls from Manchester, Birmingham and Glasgow, initially watched her with suspicion, wondering if the princess would receive special treatment or prove too delicate for real work. They discovered otherwise within the first week. The Briton Princess Elizabeth served in early 1945 barely resembled the country her father had inherited 9 years earlier. 6 years of total war had transformed everything. German V-2 rockets still fell on London with terrifying randomness. The last one would kill 27 people in Whitechapel, just 4 days before Elizabeth completed her driver training course. Food rationing had grown stricter, not easier. Clothing coupons limited families to one new outfit per year. The blackout continued. Tens of thousands of British families waited anxiously for news from sons, husbands and fathers fighting their way across the Rhine into Germany's heartland. Victory felt close but not yet certain, and Britain's survival still depended on keeping thousands of military vehicles running despite parts shortages, worn-out components and brutal operating conditions. Every lorry mattered, every ambulance counted, every staff car needed to start reliably in sub-zero temperatures, because delayed dispatches could mean delayed orders, and delayed orders could cost lives. The women of the Auxiliary Territorial Service kept this vast mechanical ecosystem functioning. They drove supply trucks through blackout conditions on unlit roads. They maintained ambulances that ferried wounded soldiers from ports to hospitals. They serviced the staff cars that transported generals to planning meetings where the invasion of Germany was being coordinated. These weren't make-work positions created to make women feel involved. The ATS performed genuinely essential labour that freed men for frontline combat roles, and now a princess was learning to do it properly, not pretending, not posing for photographs whilst a real mechanic did the actual work off stage. Elizabeth's instructors had received clear directions. Treat her exactly like every other recruit. If she couldn't diagnose why a carburetor was flooding, she failed that module and repeated it until she got it right. If she couldn't change a wheel bearing to regulation standard, she stayed after hours practicing until her hands learned the muscle memory. The teenage princess, who had spent her entire life surrounded by servants who anticipated her every need, was now expected to crawl underneath lorries in freezing mud, memorize the function of every component in a vehicle's electrical system, and master the precise technique for adjusting tappet clearances on a straight-six engine. Her presence in that Camberley workshop represented something unprecedented in British royal history. But understanding why she was there, why King George VI finally, reluctantly agreed to let his heir trade her tiara for a toolkit, requires understanding just how desperately close Britain had come to losing everything. By 1944, Britain had been fighting for 5 years straight, and the exhaustion showed in everything. The nation had mobilized more completely than any democracy in history. A higher percentage of its population, a greater share of its industrial capacity, a deeper reach into every household's daily life than even Germany or the Soviet Union. 90% of single women aged between 18 and 40 worked in war industries or wore uniforms. Married women with older children staffed munitions factories, drove buses, operated anti-aircraft batteries, and kept farms producing despite most agricultural labourers having joined the forces. Britain had thrown everything it possessed into the fight, and by the winter of 1944 to 45, the country was running on fumes and determination. The statistics told a stark story. Nearly 5 million British women served in essential war work or the armed forces. The Auxiliary Territorial Service alone numbered over 200,000 by late 1944, performing more than 80 different military trades. ATS women operated searchlights, plotted enemy aircraft movements, maintained complex communication networks, and kept the entire military transport system functioning. They worked 12-hour shifts in freezing conditions. They lived in drafty barracks. They earned a fraction of what male soldiers received, and they were absolutely indispensable. The British military would have collapsed without them. This wasn't volunteerism driven by patriotic enthusiasm. After initial recruitment drives fell short, the government implemented conscription for women, something unprecedented in British history. The National Service Act of 1941 made unmarried women aged between 20 and 30 liable for compulsory service in war industries or auxiliary forces. By 1943, the upper age limit had risen to 51. The state could direct you to work in a munitions factory 200 miles from home. It could assign you to the Land Army, harvesting sugar beets in Norfolk. It could put you in uniform and send you to maintain vehicles, operate radio equipment, or analyze reconnaissance photographs. Your social class, your education, your family's wealth, none of it bought exemption. That represented a profound break with everything Britain's class system had promised for centuries. Before the war, privilege meant protection. Wealth bought distance from discomfort. The right family name opened doors to comfortable positions and safe careers. Young women from aristocratic families made their debuts at court, married suitable men, and managed country estates. They certainly didn't kneel in motor oil learning to gap spark plugs. But total war had its own logic, and that logic recognized no hereditary privileges. When German bombers could kill a duchess as easily as a docker, when U-boats strangled supply convoys regardless of whether they carried champagne for Mayfair or powdered milk for Manchester, the old hierarchies seemed suddenly absurd. The royal family understood they couldn't remain insulated whilst demanding sacrifice from everyone else. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth refused to leave London during the Blitz, even after Buckingham Palace took direct hits. 9 separate bombing strikes damaged the palace between 1940 and 1941. They visited bombed neighbourhoods, toured munitions factories, and maintained exhausting schedules of morale-building appearances. The Queen famously remarked after the palace was bombed, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." That sentiment, that the Crown earned legitimacy through shared suffering, became the family's guiding principle. Princess Elizabeth watched all this from the protected bubble her parents had constructed around her and her younger sister Margaret. She saw women her own age in uniform. She read about ATS drivers killed when their convoy was strafed. She understood that thousands of families were sacrificing their daughters whilst hers remained safe. And she decided that wasn't acceptable anymore. What followed was a 2-year campaign that would fundamentally change what it meant to be royal in modern Britain. Elizabeth first raised the subject in 1943, when she was 16. Her timing was deliberate. That February, all women aged between 18 and 45 were required to register for war work. She pointed out to her father that in 2 years she would reach the age when the government could legally conscript her. Surely it made more sense for the heir to the throne to volunteer, rather than wait to be called up like any ordinary citizen. King George listened, nodded sympathetically, and refused. His daughter was too young, the war was too dangerous, and her constitutional position made military service inappropriate. The matter was closed, except Elizabeth refused to let it close. She raised it again in the summer of 1943, then again in autumn. She had allies. Her mother quietly supported her, understanding that the public would expect the princess to serve once she turned 18. Churchill himself mentioned during a dinner at Windsor Castle that the princess's service would provide an enormous morale boost. But the king remained immovable. He'd already lost his brother George, Duke of Kent, killed in a mysterious aircraft crash in Scotland in 1942 whilst on active service. The prospect of his heir facing even minimal danger made him physically anxious. The king's resistance wasn't purely personal fear. Genuine constitutional concerns complicated matters. Elizabeth was heir presumptive. The next monarch, unless her father produced a male heir, which by 1943 seemed biologically unlikely given the Queen's age. What happened if Elizabeth was injured or killed while serving? The succession would pass to 10-year-old Princess Margaret, requiring a lengthy regency that could destabilise the monarchy precisely when national unity mattered most. And there were darker scenarios the king's advisers quietly discussed. What if Elizabeth was captured during an enemy raid? The propaganda value to Germany of holding the British heir would be incalculable. Hitler could broadcast her statements, claim she opposed Churchill's government, or simply use her as a bargaining chip in negotiations. These weren't paranoid fantasies. German intelligence knew exactly who Elizabeth was and where she lived. Luftwaffe bombers had deliberately targeted Buckingham Palace multiple times. In 1940, British intelligence uncovered a Nazi plan to kidnap the Duke and Duchess of Windsor from Portugal. If they'd attempt that with the abdicated former king, they'd certainly consider operations against the heir. The king's protective instincts had rational foundations beyond simple fatherly worry. But Elizabeth possessed a weapon her father couldn't counter, his own sense of duty. She'd been raised to understand that being royal meant service, not privilege. Her grandfather, George V, had drilled that principle into his sons. Her father had demonstrated it throughout the war, refusing safety whilst his subjects endured danger. Now Elizabeth turned that value system back on its creators. How could she credibly become queen one day if she'd hidden behind palace walls whilst every other woman her age sacrificed for the nation? What moral authority would she possess? How could she ask future generations to do their duty if she'd shirked hers? The arguments continued throughout 1944. By October, with Elizabeth approaching 19, the king recognised he was losing. The precedent-shattering nature of his decision troubled him. No British monarch's heir had served in the military during wartime since the medieval period. Male heirs commanded regiments, certainly, but that was ceremonial leadership, not driving lorries through blackouts or stripping engines. Yet the war had shattered so many precedents already. Why should this one survive when nothing else had? In February 1945, King George VI surrendered. His daughter could join the Auxiliary Territorial Service, but there would be conditions, strict conditions that aimed to balance her desire for genuine service with the constitutional necessity of keeping her safe. On the 24th of February, 1945, the King's private secretary released a brief statement to the press. Her Royal Highness the Princess Elizabeth has been granted a commission in the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service with the rank of Second Subaltern. The newspapers erupted. Photographs of the princess in uniform dominated front pages. The Daily Mirror's headline shouted, "Princess to wear khaki." The Times published a sober editorial noting that for the first time in modern history, the heir to the British throne would serve as an ordinary member of the armed forces during wartime, ordinary being a relative term, of course. The conditions her father imposed ensured Elizabeth's service bore little resemblance to what working-class ATS recruits experienced. She wouldn't live in barracks. Every evening a car would collect her from Camberley and drive her back to Windsor Castle, 15 miles away, where she'd sleep in her own bed. She wouldn't eat service rations. The royal family's kitchens would continue providing her meals. She wouldn't face the possibility of being posted to distant bases or sent overseas. And she'd be surrounded by security that, whilst discreet, was always present. A female detective from Special Branch enrolled in the course alongside her, posing as an ordinary recruit. Military police maintained heightened vigilance around the training centre. The conditions represented a compromise between genuine service and basic security sense. Yet within those constraints, Elizabeth's training would be entirely real. That was the crucial detail that separated theatre from substance. Her instructors received unambiguous orders, no special treatment regarding the actual work. If she couldn't master the material, she failed. Her service number, 230803, appeared on all official documents. She wore the same scratchy wool uniform as every other ATS member. She stood in the same queues, used the same latrines, and got her hands just as filthy as the other trainees. The compromise was that she went home at night. The reality was that during working hours, she was expected to meet exactly the same standards as everyone else. Her fellow trainees didn't quite know what to make of her initially. Most came from backgrounds where royalty existed only on stamps and cinema newsreels. Now the King's daughter was learning to drive lorries alongside them, sharing tea breaks, struggling with the same frustratingly complex manuals that explained timing advanced mechanisms in impenetrable technical language. Some instructors worried she might prove hopeless. After all, she'd never so much as made her own bed before joining up, let alone diagnosed why an engine was misfiring. The upper classes weren't known for practical competence with machinery. Those concerns evaporated within days. Elizabeth possessed something more useful than natural mechanical aptitude. She had an almost pathological determination not to fail at anything. She'd been raised to believe that Windsors never gave up, never showed weakness, never admitted defeat. That personality trait, combined with genuine intellectual capability and physical coordination, meant she attacked each technical challenge with focused intensity. When she couldn't understand how a clutch worked, she stayed after the lesson asking questions until it made sense. When her first attempt at changing a spark plug was clumsy, she practiced on her own time until her hands learned the proper technique. When she initially struggled to reverse a lorry into a tight space, she arrived early the next morning to practice the maneuver repeatedly. The training program lasted 6 weeks and covered an extraordinary range of mechanical skills. Elizabeth was learning to become a driver mechanic, someone who could not only operate military vehicles, but maintain and repair them under field conditions. That meant understanding how every major system worked and diagnosing problems when things went wrong. The curriculum began with theory that quickly proved more complex than Elizabeth had anticipated. Internal combustion engines involved dozens of precisely timed events, occurring thousands of times per minute. Air and petrol must mix in exact proportions. Too rich and the engine floods, too lean and it overheats. That mixture must ignite at precisely the right moment in the piston's cycle, creating controlled explosions that push the piston down with enough force to turn the crankshaft without destroying the engine. Timing that's off by even a few degrees causes misfires, power loss, or catastrophic damage. Elizabeth spent hours studying diagrams showing how the four-stroke cycle worked: intake, compression, power, exhaust. She memorized the firing order for the Bedford's six-cylinder engine: 1, 5, 3, 6, 2, 4. Get that sequence wrong when reconnecting spark plug leads, and the lorry wouldn't start at all. Carburetors proved particularly challenging. These deceptively simple-looking devices performed incredibly complex fluid dynamics, using vacuum pressure and carefully calibrated jets to atomize liquid petrol into a fine mist that could burn efficiently. The Solex carburetors fitted to most military vehicles had multiple adjustments: idle mixture screws, main jets, accelerator pumps, choke mechanisms. Each required precise setting, and Elizabeth learned to recognize the symptoms of incorrect adjustment. Black smoke from the exhaust meant too much fuel. Hesitation when accelerating suggested the accelerator pump wasn't delivering enough petrol. Hunting idle, the engine's speed constantly rising and falling, indicated incorrect mixture at low throttle openings. She practiced disassembling carburetors, cleaning every tiny passage with compressed air, checking float levels, and reassembling them without leaving any parts over. Ignition systems demanded equal attention. The magneto on military vehicles generated the high-voltage spark needed to ignite the fuel-air mixture, but the entire system had to work perfectly, or nothing happened. Elizabeth learned to check distributor caps for cracks, examine rotor arms for burning, measure spark plug gaps with feeler gauges, and test ignition timing with a strobe light. She discovered that spark plugs told stories about engine condition. White ceramic insulators meant the engine ran too hot. Black sooty deposits indicated rich mixture or incomplete combustion. Oil-fouled plugs suggested worn piston rings, allowing lubricant into the cylinders. Reading these signs meant diagnosing problems before they caused breakdowns. The cooling system received similar scrutiny. Military vehicles worked hard, often in extreme conditions, generating enormous heat that had to be dissipated or the engine would seize. Elizabeth learned to check coolant levels, test thermostats, inspect water pumps for leaks, and understand why air bubbles in the cooling system could cause catastrophic overheating. She practiced bleeding cooling systems after repairs, ensuring no trapped air remained to create hotspots. The instructors emphasized that neglecting cooling system maintenance in the field could leave a convoy stranded, blocking critical roads and making vehicles sitting targets for enemy aircraft. Lubrication proved equally critical. Oil didn't just reduce friction, it sealed piston rings, cooled components, and carried away the microscopic metal particles that accumulated as parts wore. Elizabeth learned to check oil pressure, recognize the signs of oil starvation, understand why different viscosities were needed for different temperatures, and drain and refill sumps properly. The instructors drilled home that more military vehicles failed from maintenance neglect than enemy action. A driver who ignored oil levels or missed service intervals could disable her vehicle more effectively than any German shell. Beyond engines, the course covered complete vehicle systems. Braking systems using hydraulic fluid that had to remain uncontaminated. Electrical systems where corroded connections could drain batteries overnight. Suspension components that wore out carrying heavy loads over rough roads. Transmission systems where grinding gears indicated improper clutch technique or worn synchronizers. The workshops at Camberley housed an entire fleet of military vehicles representing every major type the British Army used for transport and logistics. Elizabeth's hands-on training rotated through them all, ensuring she could maintain whatever vehicle she might be assigned to drive. The Bedford OY 3-ton lorry became her primary training vehicle. These workhorses formed the backbone of British military transport, carrying supplies, ammunition, and equipment across every theatre of war. The Bedford's straight-six petrol engine produced only 72 horsepower, but it was engineered for reliability and field maintenance rather than performance. Elizabeth learned to strip that engine down to its bare block and rebuild it, laying out every component in order so nothing went missing during reassembly. The process began with draining fluids, oil, coolant, fuel, then disconnecting every external system before the engine could be lifted out. Removing the cylinder head exposed the valves, and Elizabeth learned to check valve stem seals, measure valve spring tension, and lap valves into their seats using grinding paste until they sealed perfectly. She pulled pistons from cylinders, measuring bore wear with micrometers, checking piston rings for gaps, and understanding that excessive wear meant oil consumption and power loss. Crankshaft main bearings required careful measurement. Too tight and the engine seized from friction, too loose and the shaft hammered the bearings to pieces. She learned that mechanics worked to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. That precision mattered more than brute force, and that rushed work led to failures in the field. Austin K2 ambulances presented different challenges. These vehicles carried wounded soldiers from casualty clearing stations to hospitals, often over appalling roads under blackout conditions. Reliability wasn't just operationally important, it was literally life or death. The Austin's 4-cylinder engine was smaller than the Bedford's, but needed to be just as dependable. Elizabeth learned to diagnose why an ambulance might lose power climbing hills. Could be ignition timing, could be fuel starvation, could be a slipping clutch. She practiced the systematic approach instructors drilled into every trainee. Observe symptoms, form hypotheses, test each possibility until you found the problem. Guessing wasted time and resources the military didn't have to spare. Morris commercial lorries added another vehicle type to her repertoire. These lighter trucks handled different duties than the heavier Bedfords, and their engines had different maintenance requirements. Elizabeth learned that each manufacturer had quirks. Morris engines had a tendency for water pump failures. Bedford gearboxes needed particular attention to oil levels. Austin electrical systems suffered from corroded earth connections. Experienced mechanics knew these patterns and checked the vulnerable points first when diagnosing problems. Timing chains provided particularly instructive lessons. These critical components linked the crankshaft to the camshaft, ensuring valves opened and closed in perfect synchronization with piston movement. A worn timing chain introduced slack into this relationship, retarding valve timing and costing power. Worse, a broken timing chain meant pistons and valves collided with catastrophic results. Bent valves, smashed pistons, destroyed engines. Elizabeth learned to check timing chain tension, recognize the rattling noise that indicated wear, and understand why regular maintenance prevented expensive failures. The instructors used broken engines as teaching tools, showing trainees what happened when maintenance was neglected, letting them see the twisted metal carnage that resulted from a snapped timing chain at high revolutions. The practical work was filthy, exhausting, and occasionally dangerous. Engines were heavy. Cylinder heads alone weighed over 30 pounds. Seized bolts required careful application of heat and penetrating oil, not brute force that snapped them off. Sharp metal edges cut unwary hands. Battery acid burned skin and dissolved clothing. Elizabeth learned to work carefully, wear protective equipment, and never take shortcuts that might cause injury. By the end of her 6-week course in April 1945, something fundamental had shifted in how Elizabeth understood both herself and the world outside palace walls. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden. No single moment of revelation transformed her. Instead, the cumulative weight of daily experience, working alongside women from completely different backgrounds, gradually reshaped assumptions she'd never consciously examined because she'd never needed to. Those fellow trainees taught her lessons no amount of constitutional tutoring could provide. The girl from Glasgow, who could diagnose a faulty fuel pump by sound alone, had left school at 14 to work in her father's garage. The woman from Birmingham, who explained electrical systems with perfect clarity, had been a telephone exchange operator before conscription. The trainee from Manchester, who showed Elizabeth the quickest way to bleed brake lines, had 3 brothers serving overseas and a mother working night shifts at a munitions factory. These women possessed competencies Elizabeth had never needed to develop, came from worlds she'd only glimpsed from motorcar windows during royal tours, and treated mechanical problems with a practical directness that her rarefied upbringing hadn't encouraged. They also possessed something else, a dark humour about hardship that helped them endure. When one trainee's husband was reported missing in action, the others quietly absorbed her duties whilst she processed the news, then gently pulled her back into work routine because sitting alone magnified grief. When another received a letter saying her house had been bombed flat, destroying everything her family owned, the response was sardonic jokes about not needing to dust anymore, followed by genuine offers of spare clothing coupons and ration books. Elizabeth watched this mutual support system operate. No sentimentality, no elaborate emotional displays, just practical help delivered matter-of-factly, because that's what comrades did for each other. She'd never had comrades before. She'd had subjects who deferred to her, servants who anticipated her needs, family who loved her, and tutors who educated her. But she'd never been part of a team where her contribution was judged purely on competence, where mucking in mattered more than rank, where getting your hands dirty earned respect whilst expecting special treatment earned contempt. The ATS made her one member of a group working towards shared goals, and that experience fundamentally altered how she understood leadership. Traditional royal leadership meant standing above, literally elevated on platforms and balconies, metaphorically separated by protocol and deference. Elizabeth discovered that effective leadership could also mean standing alongside, demonstrating through personal example that you'd never ask others to do what you wouldn't do yourself. When she crawled under lorries in freezing mud to access sump plugs, when she came back from lunch breaks with oil stains on her uniform that wouldn't wash out, when she stayed late practicing difficult procedures until she got them right, she was signalling something that would define her entire reign. Duty meant doing the work, not just occupying the position. The mechanical competence itself mattered less than the mindset it created. Learning to diagnose engine problems taught systematic thinking. Don't assume, test hypotheses, gather evidence, eliminate possibilities until you find the answer. That approach proved useful for navigating constitutional crises decades later. Understanding that precision mattered, that shortcuts caused failures, that maintenance prevented breakdowns, these principles applied to institutions as readily as to engines. And discovering that she could master genuinely difficult technical material gave her confidence that she could learn whatever her role demanded, whether that was nuclear deterrence strategy, Commonwealth constitutional law, or the complexities of modern financial systems. Most people assumed Elizabeth's mechanical phase ended when she completed her ATS training on the 14th of April, 1945. The war in Europe would finish 3 weeks later. Surely the heir to the throne would return to more appropriate royal pursuits. Needlework, perhaps, or watercolour painting. They fundamentally misunderstood what those 6 weeks had awakened in her. Elizabeth had discovered she genuinely enjoyed understanding how things worked, and that curiosity never diminished. It became a defining characteristic of her 70-year reign. At Balmoral, the royal family's Scottish estate, she maintained her own Land Rovers well into her 80s. Not symbolic maintenance for photographers, actual mechanical work performed in the estate's workshops. She changed oil, adjusted carburetors for the thinner air at higher altitudes, and diagnosed why an engine was running rough. Estate staff grew accustomed to finding the Queen beneath a Land Rover, methodically working through a problem. When electronic fuel injection replaced carburetors in the 1980s, she learned the new systems. When disc brakes replaced drums, she understood the engineering improvements that made them superior. Her mechanical knowledge remained current because she actively maintained it. This wasn't eccentricity, it was intellectual consistency. If you understood how engines worked at 18, why would you stop caring at 40 or 60 or 80? The principles didn't change just because you'd become queen, and Elizabeth took genuine pleasure in mechanical competence. She enjoyed the concrete certainty of it. Either the engine ran properly, or it didn't. Either you'd correctly diagnosed the problem, or you hadn't. There was no ambiguity, no diplomatic nuance, no careful navigation of constitutional precedent. Just physics and chemistry operating according to fixed laws. That mindset shaped how she approached technology throughout her reign. When the Royal Navy briefed her on nuclear submarine propulsion in the 1960s, she asked detailed questions about reactor containment, coolant systems, and fail-safe mechanisms until she understood not just what the technology did, but how it worked. When Concorde entered service, she wanted to understand supersonic aerodynamics and the engineering solutions that managed the aircraft's heat expansion at twice the speed of sound. When computers began transforming government in the 1980s, she learned to use them herself, rather than delegating to staff, sending her first email in 1976, before most of her prime ministers understood what email was. Military personnel particularly appreciated her technical knowledge. During ship inspections, she could discuss propulsion systems, radar capabilities, and weapons guidance mechanisms with engineering officers in their own language. She understood that modern naval vessels were staggeringly complex machines requiring constant maintenance, and asked informed questions about reliability, parts availability, and maintenance cycles. Officers discovered that, unlike most visiting dignitaries who nodded politely through technical briefings, the Queen actually grasped what they were telling her and asked questions that revealed genuine comprehension. This competence earned respect that no amount of ceremony could provide. Engineers and technicians recognized that she'd genuinely done the work. Her hands had been inside engines. She'd felt how a worn bearing sounded different from a healthy one. She'd experienced the satisfaction of diagnosing a problem correctly and the frustration of misdiagnosis. She wasn't a dilettante playing at mechanical knowledge. She was someone who'd learned properly and maintained that knowledge through decades of continued interest. The contrast with previous monarchs was stark. Queen Victoria had no understanding of the technology transforming her kingdom. Edward VII viewed motors as toys for aristocratic amusement. George V appreciated naval engineering, but never worked on it himself. Elizabeth was the first British monarch who could legitimately claim to understand, at a practical level, how the machines that underpinned modern society actually functioned. That wartime service established something unprecedented in the thousand-year history of the British monarchy, the principle that the crown earned its position through demonstrated service rather than inherited divine right. Previous generations of royals had claimed authority based on bloodline and tradition. Elizabeth's generation would claim legitimacy based on duty fulfilled, sacrifice shared, and competence proven. The 6 weeks she spent learning to change tank engines became the foundation myth of the modern monarchy. The timing mattered enormously. Britain emerged from the Second World War exhausted and determined to build something different from the rigid class system that had existed before. The Labour government elected in 1945 created the National Health Service, expanded education, and dismantled some of the most obvious barriers separating classes. The population that had fought together, sacrificed together, and survived together wasn't interested in returning to the old hierarchies where privilege derived from accident of birth rather than merit or effort. The monarchy's survival required adapting to this new reality. Elizabeth understood this in ways her uncle, Edward VIII, never had. Edward viewed being royal as entitlement. The world owed him deference, luxury, and the freedom to do as he pleased. That attitude cost him the throne in 1936 when he insisted on marrying Wallis Simpson despite constitutional objections. He never grasped that monarchy and a democracy required justifying your position through service. Elizabeth absorbed the opposite lesson during her ATS months. She learned that respect had to be earned through competence and shared hardship, that people judged you on whether you did the work properly, and that privilege without duty was indefensible. That principle guided her entire reign. When she ascended the throne in 1952, at just 25 years old, she brought the work ethic she'd learned at Camberley to the most demanding job in Britain. The famous red boxes of government documents arrived daily, and she read every page, not skimming, not delegating, but genuinely engaging with the material. Prime ministers discovered she'd studied briefing papers more thoroughly than they had. Commonwealth leaders found she'd memorized details about their country's political situations. She approached being queen the way she'd approached stripping engines, methodically, precisely, with the understanding that the work mattered and cutting corners wasn't acceptable. The public noticed. Throughout 70 years, through massive social changes, through scandals that damaged other royals, through periods when monarchy itself seemed anachronistic, Elizabeth maintained approval ratings that politicians envied. That support didn't derive primarily from affection, though many people genuinely liked her. It came from respect for someone who'd visibly done her duty without complaint for longer than most people had been alive. She'd proven herself at 18 in those Camberley workshops, and she kept proving herself every year afterwards. The photographs of Second Subaltern Windsor in her ATS uniform, hands covered in grease, became iconic precisely because they captured something essential about the monarch she would become. Not remote, not decorative, not a figurehead going through ceremonial motions, but someone who'd genuinely rolled up her sleeves and done difficult, necessary work alongside ordinary people. That image granted her a kind of moral authority no coronation ceremony could provide. When Elizabeth died in September 2022 at 96, the coverage inevitably focused on her record-breaking reign, her steady presence through decades of change, her dedication to duty. But understanding why she became that person requires going back to those 6 weeks in 1945 when she learned to change tank engines. That experience taught her that service mattered more than status, that competence earned respect, and that genuine sacrifice created bonds stronger than any protocol. She spent 70 years applying those lessons,